So again, good morning. Good to be with everybody. Um, that storm rolled in last week, and nobody set the temperature back to normal. So, whoever is responsible for that, if they could just elevate it a little bit, just a little bit, that'd be great. Getting a little concerned that we is going to get really cold here before long, huh? But nonetheless, this morning, if you recall, last week we said that we were going to do a little mini series on church responsibilities. Earlier in the year, a couple months ago, or about a month and a half ago, we looked at individual or Christian responsibilities, and now we're looking at church responsibilities. And we really have just two more lessons, unless there's some other area that you want to explore. But this next one is going to be on the church responsibility and benevolence. We're going to look at what benevolence is, and then look at what the churches, a little bit of what the individual responsibility is as well, but mainly the church responsibility, because I think a lot of churches get this wrong, if you will. And then the last one will be on the church's responsibility in preaching and teaching, and then if there's some other area that you want to explore that maybe we're a topic that you want to look at from on what the church's responsibility is, let me know. I can certainly research that and put together something, and we can take a look at it. But for this morning's topic, we're going to look at benevolence and what is the church's responsibility. Over in Romans chapter 15 and verse 25 and 26, we see, "But now I am going to Jerusalem to minister to the saints, for it pleased those from Macedonia and Achaia to make a certain contribution for the poor among the saints who are in Jerusalem." So here Paul's mentioning that he collected funds and he's going to Jerusalem to minister unto individuals with these funds that were collected by these churches. So in other words, he's going to deliver some benevolence. In 1 Corinthians chapter 16, 1 and 2, as we just talked about in the Lord's Supper, we see, "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given orders to the churches Galatia, so must you also. On the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside, storing up as he may prosper, that there be no collections when I come." Well, one of the reasons why we say we collect funds, and just as they did there in Romans chapter 15, is for benevolence. And we're going to take a look at this idea of benevolence and what that means. As far as what benevolence is, benevolence, as used among the brethren, or I would argue in the scriptures, it refers to caring for the needy. Okay, any way that we care for the needy, those who are in need. And so to help us understand this subject, we will consider two aspects of New Testament teachings about the poor, because those who are poor, or they're poor of something, or in need of something. That's why they're poor. They're lacking, if you will. So we see that some are poor in spirit. Whoops. You said a booby trap? I didn't touch it. Careful. Maybe I'll get a new one of those. I don't know. Hopefully, that's less of those noises. Anyways, this idea of being poor. And the two areas I want to explore is the problems with the poor, or defining what is poor, and then aid. Then how do we facilitate meeting those requirements for the poor, the aid for that poor? So let's begin with the first one, the problem with the poor. Consider Mark chapter 14, verses 3 through 7. when we read over there, Mark records, and being in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper, as he sat at the table, a woman came, having an alabaster flask of a very costly oil of spikenard or spic, huh? Spikenard. Then she broke the flask and poured it on his head. But there were some who were ignorant um, among them and said, why was that fragrant oil wasted? For it might have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor. And they criticized her sharply. But Jesus said, let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a good work for me, for you have the poor with you always, and whenever you wish, you may do them good, but me you do not always have. Of course, we look at this passage for many reasons. Here a woman brings very expensive oil or fragrant substance and uses it to anoint Christ. And some of his disciples are like, why are we wasting that money on him? Why are we wasting that oil? We could have, we could have sold that and done a lot of good, and and we see that we could have given it to the poor. Okay, this idea, but we could have used it to bestow benevolence. And then it goes on for there. But we just the purpose of bringing this forward is that we see this even back then they were concerned about the poor or the needy. So what I call this side the poor problem. What is poor? Verse 7 of the passage that we read, points out that it's a perpetual problem. It will never go away. They will always be here. There will always be somebody who does not have, and there will always be those who do have. So it was that way from the beginning. It was that way during the time of Christ, and it's certainly that way today. So and I guess why I'm harping on that is because I don't know, when I turn on my TV, there's always at least 3 or 4 commercials of an evening that's talking about the poor. How do we feed those in this land? How do we feed those in this land? Well, and or people complaining, well, why are we sending all this money over there? We haven't even taken care of the poor in our country, and so forth. So in other words, the debate still rages on today, just as it did during the time of Christ, on how to deal with the poor problem. And then I would say that it becomes a priority problem when we start to peel back the layers, if you will, as like an onion, as we start to peel back the many layers to see what's inside the poor problem, that it's a perpetual problem, and then it ends up being a priority problem. Priority in that the poor was not Jesus's greatest concern. Certainly, he could have, in the passage that we read, he certainly could have sold the oil and he could have focused his entire ministry on how to take care of the poor. But he didn't, did he? Matter of fact, we see he had a great affection, I would say, concern for the poor, and he would go and heal many. But that was not his greatest concern. I would argue that his greatest concern was not the poor, but the lost. That was his greatest concern. It wasn't what everybody was putting on the food or what everybody had in their stomach that day or what everybody was wearing or what that everybody had shelter. That wasn't his greatest concern. His greatest concern was saving the lost and doing the will of the Father. another priority is that did not declare a war on poverty, but a war on sin, and and we gotta realize that, because I think too many churches lose the focus on the sinners, and and they end up focusing solely upon feeding those that they believe that are the poor, and it, you know, granted, as we'll go through this, should not ignore the poor, and we should help the poor. That's not what we're saying. But as far as priority goes, our number one priority, we should be more concerned about the poor's soul than their belly, is what I'm trying to point out, because I think that's what the priorities that Christ had. And we do not seek absolute economic or social equality, but spiritual equality. Because this is something that's richly debated within our society or within politics today. They, you know, if you look, follow politics very much, there are those who are peddling what they call socialism. The idea that everybody needs to have the same, and this has been a centuries long debate, and not everybody's going to ever have the same. Again, not everybody has ever had the same, and in those countries where they've tried that experiment, corruption reigns fervent. It ends up being very lopsided. In other words, those that are in political power have much, and those who do not have the very least. And so that's not a business. In other words, that's not a business that the church ought to be into. We're not trying to solve world hunger, and we certainly aren't teaching that everybody should have equal amongst all the brethren. That's not it's not reality, nor is it ever going to be able to be done. But we all can have spiritual equality through Christ Jesus, in that we all can become Christians. We all hear the same gospel proclaimed. There is no social order within the gospel. Those who think that those who are the least will be the greatest, it flips everything on its head, if you will. So we should be mostly concerned about spiritual equality, or speaking or preaching the spiritual message, not an economy message, is what I'm trying to emphasize. Economic equality was taught was freedom from want, if you will. Consider 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 14. It says, But by inequality, that now at this time your abundance may supply their lack, that their abundance also may supply your lack, that there may be equality. Acts chapter 2, verses 44 and 45. Not all who believed were together and had all things in common, and sold their possessions and goods and divided among them all as everyone had need. Again, I don't think that not everybody had exactly equal amounts of everything. I don't think that's what the scriptures is talking about. Acts chapter 4, verse 32 says, Now the multitude of those who believed were of one accord and one soul. Neither did anyone say that any of these things he possessed was his own, but that they had all things in common. And then in verse 34, it says, and laid them at the apostles' feet, and they distributed to each as anyone had need. Now, does that mean that everybody had, that everything in the church at the beginning was equal? I don't think so, because we also read where they were meeting in houses, going from house to house. Now, does that mean that those houses, that whoever owned them previously no longer owned them? I don't think that that's what the case was. I think what it means that they had all things in common is that they treated as all things were in common. In other words, what is mine is yours, what is yours is mine. Not that they actually sold those things and that everybody had an equal portion of them, but they treated them as, you know, if you need a place to stay, you're free to stay here. If you hey, we have excess food here. Why don't you come and eat this meal with us? And that they shared things and they looked out for one another's uh, well-being, if you will. I think that's what is being taught here, but not that it was social economics here, and not that everything was literally sold, put into one pile, and the apostle says, "Here's this, put one for you, one for you, one for you, two for me, one for you know." I don't. That's not what. That's. I don't think that's what's being said here within these scriptures. Some might try to take that out of context and say that, but that's certainly not. Uh, I don't think what is being said here within that. The poor get top priority under the social gospel system. Now, the social gospel is those church that again that don't focus so much on the soul, but they focus more on, you know, we need to feed the hungry, and those efforts, we usually see that in denominationalism. We see that the priority is that we feed, relieve, you know, we tend to these physical needs, and then as we have opportunity, then we'll teach. And well, what if they don't want? Well, if they don't want to hear it, then that's fine. Something that comes. The Salvation Army is a ministry much like that. We don't turn anybody away. But then, from my understanding, while they're having a meal or while they're getting stuff, here's a tract, or can we pray for you? They'll try to sneak it in, or if you will. And it's like not that they were feeding the poor, but they were focused on athletics. But there was this Facebook group that I belonged to. It was something about Churches of Christ, but it was liberal as well as conservative brethren in one group, if you will, chatting. And I think I mentioned this before, that this individual was talking about the gymnasium that their church built, and how great a tool that was. He was really bragging it up. But when I talked offline with him, and it's like, well, how do you use that as an evangelistic tool? So, well, we have all these ball tournaments, we have these different functions and stuff. We get all these people in, and it's like, well, okay, that's great, but how do you use that? Well, at halftime, one of the ministers will come and they'll lead a little discussion or whatnot, or we'll pray, or we'll ask people to pray, or we'll hand out information and stuff during these tournaments and stuff. And so as we continue to go back and forth in our discussions and stuff, I asked him, okay, so you spent all these thousands of dollars and you've had all these tournaments. How many people have you increased in number? And then silence fell. And it took him forever to respond. And he said, you know what? I've never really considered. And he said, to the best of my knowledge, maybe a handful. And I call this the bait and switch tactic, is what I call it. We here we're talking about feed, relieve, then teach. Some entertain some more, and then preach, if you will. But it completely reverses, like I say, the focus at Christ's number one priority was, redeeming the lost. That was his primary focus. Yes, he provided benevolence, he provided relief, but he used that as what? As a tool to either show that he was the Son of God. In other words, it was a miraculous event, like the feeding of the 5,000 or whatnot, that confirmed that Nobody could do this except somebody from God. And then, oh, by the way, he would then preach and teach and was mostly convert. Even the 5,000, once he saw that they weren't interested in spiritual food, he did what? He left. He stopped doing that. It's like, well, this is my words, not his. It's a waste of time. I'm not going to sit here and feed your bellies for you to be fat, dumb, and happy. I'm concerned about your soul. So I'm going to go somewhere else and find somebody that wants spiritual food, not physical food. And so we got to, for those out there that get caught up in the social gospel, it just perverts the priorities. And that's something the church shouldn't do. And then last point on this is that the lost get top priority under the gospel of Christ. The lost, not the poor, but the lost. Consider John chapter 6, verses 26 through 27. Jesus answered and said, "Most assuredly I say to you, you seek me not because you saw the signs, but because you ate the loaves and were filled," just as we were talking about. "Do not labor for the food which perishes, but for the food which endures to everlasting life, which the soul of man will give you, because God the Father has set his seal on him." So again, like he said, you follow me because you want to have your bellies filled. Do not labor for the food which perishes. Don't labor. Don't let that be your sole focus. Let your focus be on what? Your spiritual well-being, your spiritual belly. Seek the food which endures forever. The bread of life, the waters of life. That's what the priority should be. We also find that it's a perception problem. Okay, so we talk about that it's a priority problem. Sometimes we get the priorities backwards. But it's also a perception problem. Perception and the wrong perception of what poor means. It doesn't mean, I got a slide full of what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean those who are merely less fortunate, especially in this country. We are the richest country in the world. There's all kinds of programs for people. If you're going hungry, then I think maybe I'm being a little bit harsh here. Maybe I'm being judgmental. But I would argue it's probably your own fault if you're going hungry. There is so much out there available for people as far as subsistence goes that a little bit of work, a little bit of effort. Now, does it instantaneously come? No. Doesn't come instantaneously. But there is a lot of things available today that the first century saints did not have, that our government provides. And so we're not talking about those people that are just a little bit less fortunate. Again, not everybody, is going to have the same level of income. Not everybody's going to have the same kind of house. Not, that's not what, again, we're not talking equality. It also does not mean those who have trouble maintaining their accustomed lifestyle. Now, this is benevolence when it comes to the church, as far as the church providing substance. We're going to get a little bit more into this. But if you fall in economic hard times, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are destitute. It may feel like you're destitute. The perception could feel as though the world's caving in on me and, oh, what I'm going to do. That's to be expected. But again, nowhere in the scripture says that life's always going to be good, and that you're going to be able to maintain everything that you've always had. There's peaks and valleys throughout life. Your job could go away, and you might have to what? Downsize. You might have to sell. Maybe we're living a life of excess, and so we're not talking as far as benevolence. Benevolence is not meant for those to maintain their accustomed lifestyle. It also does not mean those with assets that can be converted into food, clothing, and shelter. In other words, I lost my job. What am I going to do? Can the church help me out? I don't know if I'm going to be able to make my next house payment. Okay, have you talked to, what are you doing to alleviate your situation? I don't get too deep into this, but I remember we were going through a tough time down in Georgia because somebody came and petitioned the church. Not a great amount of money, but a sizable sum. Quite, probably a tenth of what the church had in its coffers. And one of the questions that I raised was, how, because this individual had now they weren't new vehicles, but they owned like 5 vehicles. They had a camper trailer, a house. They had all kinds of stuff. Now, most of it was tore up and wasn't of great value. But I asked, how much of your stuff are you selling in order to meet your financial obligations that you say you need help for? And the response was, well, I haven't done any of that. And now I didn't sit there and go, but in my mind, that's what I was doing. It's like, well, why are you here asking for money if you haven't first? Why aren't you selling off your excess things? Even if you can get a little bit of something out of them, you should do that first before petitioning the church. Again, sometimes I don't know. I realize that sometimes when we are going through hard times, we don't always clearly focus, and that's okay for the one requesting. The point of this is not to focus in on them, but is to focus in on the church. Is that the church does not need to kowtow to that line of thinking just because a brother's having a hard time. That the church needs to come out of the coffers to help them maintain their standards or to help them keep their stuff. I don't think that that's the work of the church. It also doesn't mean that those who spend money on conveniences rather than necessities ought to receive benevolence. In other words, they got spending priority problems, when you have a brother and sister coming and asking the church for assistance, but they just got off a 2-week cruise to Bangladesh or whatever, well, you ought to be scratching your head. Well, why, or somebody in the church ought to be going, well, I don't think that these are the people that we ought to be helping here. They need probably guidance on how to manage their money, not more money to spend on frivolous things. That type of thing. It also doesn't mean those with able-bodied, non-working family members living in the household, i.e. teenagers. Well, I don't want I don't want to burden little Bobby with getting an extra job. Can't the church just help us out? No. Little Bobby can get a job, part-time job, and help, meet ends. That's been the way it's been done for millennia. It might mean that you may not be able to sit on the couch and eat bonbons. It might mean that you need to roll up your sleeves and get out there and make a living for a little bit of period of time. Whomever it might be. Well, my back hurts. Well, I understand. There's a lot of jobs that don't require you to lift anything. You can just sit there in the chair. I don't know. I'm just recalling some excuses that I've heard in the past of why people couldn't get a job. But the main thing is that if these families have able-bodied people that can work, but they choose not to work, why would we be helping them? And then the last one on this slide is, it does not mean those with non-contributing working household members should receive benevolence. In other words, this would be like your in-laws live with you. They got Social Security or retirement coming in, but they don't want to contribute, or that's not part of the resources, that type of thing. Or, Bobby and Sally have part-time jobs, but that's their money to be spending on going out and having a good time or whatever. It's a family problem. Should use all the family resources to meet the family requirement. Not necessarily come and be burdening the church with benevolence requirements. So we got to be careful about our perception of what true benevolence is the point. The biblical poor were destitute of bare necessities of life. Now we're going to get into what the true perception is. We often want to look through our own lenses of what we perceive, but our perceptions aren't necessarily match up with what we read within the scriptures. Consider James chapter 2 verse 15, where it says, if a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food, naked and destitute of daily food, don't have anything, don't even have any clothes. And look at verse 16. And one of you says to them, depart in peace, be warmed and filled, but you do not give them the things which they need for the body. What does it prosper? So not going to get into too much of what verse 16 means. We can offline if you want. But the main thing is that they were destitute. They were without. They had not a zilch. These were true people that were like starving, had nothing at all. This is the Greek word pictos, I believe. The CH is pronounced like with a K, pictos. Means poor or beggar. It need what it takes to be warmed and filled, or nothing, or things needful to the body. In other words, what it's talking about, things that are a bare necessity is what's being talked about. And the latter part of verse 16, what good does it do? Is mean, if you tell them, hey, good luck in your endeavors, what good does it tell them good luck when you could fulfill their needs? If you took a little bit of your excess, you could help your fellow brother, not the church, but you. That's the question James is proposing. What good is it to slap them on the back and say, well, good luck, let me know if you find anything. That's not being a good brother or sister. We should help them meet that need. We, as in individuals, maybe not necessarily as the church. And then, due to the uncontrollable circumstances, in other words, they're destitute not because of their laziness or mismanagement of resources, but they're destitute because of uncontrollable circumstances. They couldn't help for the situation. That be literally like they had a job, and back in that day, and now they don't have a means of work, and there is no there is no social network, there is no government assistance to be had. They just have nothing. That's what's being referenced as far as the poor in the Bible, not somebody who in today's world is my point. That's what the real poor is. So now let's talk about how do we bring aid to those who are truly in need, those who are destitute, those who are without, and those that have no means and aren't there because of their own mismanagement, if you will. Well, we can divide this up into two. We have personal aid, what I have in my pocket or in my checking account or whatever, and then we got the church's aid. Church, as in church coffers, the church's bank account, however you want to parse that out. So there's my aid, and then there's the church's aid. As far as my aid, as far as what Jim Love can do, one of the reasons why we're commanded to have a job is so that we can have aid to help the needy. Have you ever considered that? Look over at Ephesians chapter 4, verse 28. It says, let him who steal no longer, but rather let him labor, working with his hands, which is good. And I think we all labor here. I don't think anybody here is a thief. But then look at that comma. There's a comma there after good. And then there's another phrase. That we may have something to give who has need. So what's Paul saying? One of the reasons why we work is so that we might have something to help our fellow brethren out. Now, he's not talking about the church. He did not say so that you can work and have something to put in the church coffers so that we might help people out. That's not what he said. What he said is that you work with your hands, which is good, that you might have something to give to him who has need. So in other words, one of the reasons why we have jobs is so that we might have resources to help those who are in need. That is a church precept. That is a Christian precept. That is a biblical precept. Then when it comes to personal finances or personal resources, not church, Galatians 6:10 is applicable to here. To do good unto all men, especially those of the household of faith. To all men, whether saint or sinner, whether thief or not thief. It doesn't matter. It can be anybody. It can be somebody inside the church. It can be somebody outside the church. It can be a family member, not a family member. I myself can do with what I want with my money to whomever I want. Now, I shouldn't facilitate evil. We're also commanded to abstain from all forms of evil. So that's not what we're advocating here. As I'm saying is that we, as individuals, can help those in the church and those outside the church. We're not constrained on who we can help. James 1:27 says, pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is to visit orphans and widows in their trouble and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. True and undefiled religion is to what? Visit and help widows in their trouble or in their afflictions. Back at that time, there was no Social Security. People couldn't sign up for welfare or for food stamps. So to go and visit and help in their affliction would be often to take subsistence with you, to help provide for them. That's what practice, that would be true. That'd be loving your brother, would it not be? And that's why he says, over in chapter 2, he says, if a brother is naked and destitute of daily food, that they're poor, they don't have anything, then what good does it do to say, hey, brother, how you doing? Why didn't you help them out? Why don't you truly love your brother by providing them some substance, getting them some food, some clothing? That would truly profit them, not just saying, hey, brother, good luck, I'll be praying for you. Now, when it comes to congregational aid or the church's aid, church's resources, is only for poor saints, needy saints. Now, saints is not everybody. Who is a saint? The members, fellow Christians, right? Those who are in Christ. That is a saint. Those outside of Christ, your neighbor, your co-worker, or whatnot, that's not a church problem. That's where your personal funds can help them, absolutely. Also, family members who are not members of the church. Not the local church, but Church Universal. So it's to the members of the congregation. Look there in Acts chapter 2, verse 42. It says, they continue steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship, in the breaking of the bread, and in prayers. Acts 4 and 34 says, nor was there anyone who lacked, for all who had possessions of land or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of the things that were sold. So they helped one another out. They sold their excess. Acts chapter 16, 1 through 3. Now in those days there were a number of disciples was multiplying. There arose a complaint against the Hebrews of the Hellenists, because their widows were neglected in the daily distribution. Now, note there it said their widows, not all widows, not widows outside the church, not the widows of Jerusalem, but their widows. The 12 summoned the multitude of the disciples and said, it is not desirable that we should leave the word of God and serve tables. Therefore, brethren, seek out from among you 7 men of good reputation, full of the Holy Spirit and wisdom, whom you can appoint over this business. And of course, we study that in Ron's Bible study. But the reason for leading you all through this is that the church had plenty of resources. That was what we read over here in 242 and Acts 34, Acts 4 and 34, that they sold their possessions and they laid it at the apostles' feet. So the apostles could feed whomever, but they weren't feeding whoever. They were what? They were taking the congregation. Nobody was lacking. And they were what? They were ministering or taking care of their widows. So there's a pattern here that the early church took care of the early church. And then we also see another pattern. That they also, as things progress, because as we get up to Acts 11, here the church, a few years passed by, church is growing, and we see examples, and here it commands, to lay by and store and collect funds. Paul going. Remember we read here, Paul was going back to Jerusalem to minister unto needy saints, that because there's a famine going on. So the pattern is that the churches in other regions where there wasn't a famine were laid by and storing. They were collecting funds. They was gathering those up, and then they were pilgriming to Jerusalem to help, not Jerusalem, but the saints at Jerusalem. In other words, Christians or members of other churches of Christ there in Jerusalem. That's the pattern. Did not go there, and they weren't feeding all of Jerusalem. They did not set up a store. They did not set up a food line. They didn't set up a soup kitchen, and were feeding all of Jerusalem. That's not the pattern. At least that's not what I deduce from these scriptures here. So it was sent directly to the church with what? The needy or the poor saints. And then who did the ministering? The elders or the overseers of those local churches. So the churches in Corinth and Galatia collected funds sent by what men were sent with Paul to Jerusalem. They turned it over. Did those men that traveled with him, did they know who needed it? No. But the overseers or the elders of those churches in Jerusalem knew who needed and who was in need. And that's why it was handed directly to those churches. And then those local churches in Jerusalem ministered to their needy saints. That's, again, the pattern that we see. Did not send through a sponsoring church. We did not see where Corinth was the sponsoring church, and that the churches of Galatia and Laodicea and all these sent everything to Corinth, and then Corinth sent a representative to say, I'm the church of Corinth and I represent all these other churches. We're going to set up a tent here, and we're going to facilitate this, and it's going to be the work of Corinth and others. We didn't see that. No, again, each church sent a representative. Paul said, I'm not in charge of that money. You send you pick somebody you can trust. Come with me. This church will give to that church, and then that church will provide the relief. Because there's a lot, men in modern era has said, we're a little bit better networked over here at the East Cambridge Church of Christ, and we could help the church at Byesville spread their resources around because we got a better network over here. Why don't you just send your stuff our way? Sounds good, doesn't it? That's the way corporate America does things, right? Hey, or what's some of those, the Hartford, and send my money, send your money to me, and I'll manage it for you, and I'll grow it for you, that type of thing. Send your benevolence to the East Cambridge Church of Christ, and we'll help ensure that needy saints get taken care of. Sounds good, right? No, that's not good. That's not how things were done. That may be how man does things, but that's not how the Holy Spirit set things up in the first century. And again, we're a first century church in the what? 21st century, right? So the principle is, or the takeaway is the church aided only saints without other means of support. Without. In other words, and how do we know that? Well, because over 1 Timothy 5 and 8, Paul says, only widows indeed should be burdened by the church. If a widow isn't, and there's a long list of qualifications, we're not, for sake of time, we're not going to go through them. But, if she was 68 years of age and under the age of 60, then she was what? Expected to go out and get remarried and find other means. Before they came to the church, they were to what? Look to their family. And Paul goes through it, and if you study it, you look, basically what Paul's saying is, before you come to the church and the church takes on the burden, and I shouldn't say burden, perhaps, but takes on facilitating to the needs of a widow. She needs to be truly a widow indeed, and she needs to go through an exhaustive list of things to ensure that she's trying to get resources elsewhere before taxing the church. Because what's the primary responsibility of the church? Is it feeding the saints, filling bellies, or saving souls? Because everybody, that's where our focus needs to be, on saving the lost. I already covered that. So, and back at this time, and to me, this is really no longer applicable as far as widows indeed, because there is no such thing as widows indeed, at least not in the United States, because we have what? We got, so anybody can get Social Security once they become at age 62, right? You can get Social Security. And if you can't work, you can still get Social Security. May not be a lot. And if you're a widow, you can get your deceased husband's Social Security. There's also unemployment to be collected, and there's all kinds of state aid, there's food stamps, there's all kinds of resources out there. Government resources that one just needs to apply. I know growing up, people thought that it was shameful. Now, I don't think that's so much today. I don't hear people saying, "Oh, there's just no way I can go apply for food." A lot of people want to get food stamps because it's just money. It's money. It's less of my money that I got to spend on food and stuff, and then I can spend on entertaining. And so people view it a little bit differently. But I can remember, that it was kind of kept hush hush. Nobody wanted to. It was kind of shameful to request those things. There's nothing shameful about that. If you need assistance, that's why we pay taxes, and those are entitlements to U.S. citizens. So if you really need them, go and do that. Don't burden the church, because the pattern is I burden everywhere else, and then if I can't get relief, then I come to the church and look to their aid as a last resource. And we can think of church benevolence as a token of fellowship that exists between church and poor saints. The contribution and distribution, if you will. And there shows this as the embodiment and proof of fellowship. This idea of taking care of or ministering to the aid of poor saints. And so and it's certainly something that we can do. But again, the priority should be first, what can I do to help my fellow brother and sister? And then if I can't do anything, then if it's a needy saint, a truly needy saint, not somebody trying to maintain standards, not somebody trying to keep their house and all those things, then what can the church do? Does it fit the pattern that's in the first century church? So as we wrap things up, let us be concerned about the poor and the needy. Absolutely, we need to. That's a charge put forth for us. Like I said, that's one of the reasons why we have jobs. But we also need to make sure that we keep our priorities straight, and that we need to mostly be concerned about their souls. And let us aid the poor personally as we have opportunity and availability, or the ability to do so. Both saint and sinner, that's to the individual. And let the church aid only those with whom it has been charged to render aid to. So that's the lesson. If you're here this morning and you're subject to the gospel call, let it be known as we stand and sing the song that's been